Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. 5 biggest question marks for this Georgia program heading into 2024. Dill, we were talking before we went live. Question marks for this Georgia program. It means a little bit of a different thing than when you're talking about some other programs across the Power 5 level. You look at this Georgia roster, there's not many glaring question marks. I think the answers are the questions that we're going to be posing are, if Georgia goes out, reaches their potential, wins a national championship, these questions are going to get answered. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section. Before we get into it, just want to say thank you to you guys, to the Georgia fans, covering this program over the last couple of weeks on the recruiting trail. Been a blast for the boys. The amount of support, the amount of go dogs you guys throw in the comments section, that stuff means the world. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, I would love to hear some feedback from you guys in the comments section. We're going to ask some questions that they have answers. I think there's a couple different ways you could go with some of these questions. I would love to hear some feedback from you guys. And without further ado, Dale, let's get into, at least in my mind, a really enticing conversation. That is, who steps up as the wide receiver one in this Georgia offense? You go back the last couple of years, it was no secret. On the money downs, this passing attack was going through 2 players, right? Ladd McConkey, Brock Bowers, both going to the NFL, both going to be studs in the NFL. Dill, if I were asking you, I would love to hear from the Georgia fans on this one as well, because there's like 5 different answers that I think you could go with. I'll ask you here, wide receiver one in this Georgia offense in 2024, who you got?
I think my gut instinct is saying Dominic Lovett, just because he's the one guy I think we've seen do it. I mean, he was the number one at Missouri. And frankly, for Georgia, this wide receiver position's probably been one of those kind of questions about how they've developed, if you will. And that's relative, obviously. They've had good wide receivers, but compared to like their offensive line, their linebackers, some of their secondary players, like you don't always feel like you have that pipeline where it's next up and they immediately step into it and really rock it. You got to replace 2 really, really good players in Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers. So I think it's fair to really kind of have this be one of those kind of linchpin questions that you have for Georgia. If they really are good and they're the old Georgia teams of the 2021, 2022 years, I think you want to see this wide receiver play kind of step up.
So I would probably push back against that in terms that I don't think they need like a true wide receiver one, because I think the answer to this is it's going to be a really balanced wide receiver. And like they got a lot of different guys that can do a lot of different things. Now, my personal answer to this question would also be Dominic Lovett for 2 reasons. One, Dominic Lovett's the kind of wide receiver that Carson Beck is going to try to get the football to. Like you look at where Carson Beck is most successful as a thrower, it's attacking that short intermediate range, work in the middle of the field. Dominic Lovett's a guy that just knows how to separate in those kind of ranges. So I think, one, from a Carson Beck standpoint, Dominic Lovett's going to be the guy. I think more importantly, we've seen Dominic Lovett be a wide receiver one in an offense going back to Missouri. And I think with Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers, who kind of ate up a lot of those short intermediate route tree concepts moving on to the NFL, I think Dominic Lovett's the guy that comes in and eats up a lot of those targets. So I think the answer would be Dominic Lovett, but you kind of make no mistake about it. This Georgia passing attack is going to be balanced, because you look at this wide receiver room and say you got a lot of different skill sets, right? Dominic Lovett, your separator. Dylan Bell, just your all around. I say this all the time. I don't get how Dylan Bell is so good, but he's an elite wide receiver in the SEC. You're bringing Colby Young, just a big boundary wide receiver. You're bringing London Humphreys. I think this is going to be a kind of balanced attack in the passing game. You mix in the tight ends and Oscar Delp and Benjamin Yurosek. Dominic Lovett, my wide receiver one, but kind of make no mistake about it, Carson Beck's going to be spreading the love around to a lot of these pass catchers.
I think Yurosek maybe frankly slept on. When like people talk about like who's going to be one of those guys to step up, I think people don't realize how bad Stanford was for the bulk of his time there, and how anemic their offense was in a sense. So I think you get him on a really good team. You saw some really good moments from him at Stanford, that ability, really savvy route runner from that tight end spot, really good hands. I kind of feel like he's going to wake a lot of people up, because I feel like people are acting like this tight end room like is going to like, and it's going to take a step back. No, like Brock Bowers irreplaceable in a sense, but I think Benjamin Yurosek going to be really. I don't think this room is going to be like poor.
Georgia fans are chill. Like the Georgia fans who know this program, they know the tight end position is not going to be a problem. It's going to be one of the better tight end rooms in the country. And hey, I've been banging the table for Benjamin Yurosek ever since he transferred to Georgia. I fell in love with Benjamin Yurosek one night, Pac-12 after dark, throwback to the Pac-12 in like 2021. And Benjamin Yurosek was just a guy in a Stanford offense that flat out sucked. He comes to an offense that's going to use him as a dynamic playmaker. Benjamin Yurosek's going to take the SEC by storm. They'll go into the number 2 question mark, and this was kind of me, I guess for lack of better terms, kind of nerding out looking at some of these numbers. Georgia didn't really push the ball down the field all that much. And I think that is something that's going to change in 2024. I think for 2 reasons. One, you can tell like Kirby Smart wants to push the ball down the field a little bit more in the passing attack, right? You go out and get London Humphreys, you go out and get Colby Young, 2 guys that can work vertically down the field. I was kind of looking at some numbers. Carson Beck's average depth of target, 8.5 yards. That's not bad. It's not necessarily that high. They didn't ask Carson Beck to push the ball down the field that much because you get into how many of his attempts went 20-plus yards down the field. The answer is 12%. Now, he completed almost 50% of those footballs, so he can push the ball down the field, attack that deeper third. They just didn't really last year. They only had 2 wide receivers that even played in the rotation that the average depth of target was over 13 yards. That was Ra Thomas and Arian Smith. So I think you inject some wide receivers that can do a better job accessing downfield. I think they're going to be asking Carson Beck to push the ball down the field a little bit more in 2024.
And I think you should want to see it because I probably said this before, but you haven't had a talent at the quarterback spot like Carson Beck, arguably since Matthew Stafford. I mean, they've had solid quarterback play for sure. I think underrated quarterback play, but they haven't had a guy who can be 1-1. Carson Beck, he's 1-1 talent. When he's on his game, he's really, really good. So I'm kind of with you. I want to see them open this up a little bit. I don't think they need to play the same way they used to play as like that old Georgia's. Again, are still going to run the ball physically. They're still going to use their tight ends. But I think you take this offense to another level if you can get the ball down the field with a little more consistency.
Yeah, and I think Kirby Smart knows that too. I think it's not a coincidence that they bring in guys like Colby Young and London Humphreys. I think there was also just kind of an element of Carson Beck's a first-year starter. We don't want to put too much on his plate. I think he emerged as that guy towards the second half of the year. I think now having a full offseason under his belt as the starting quarterback, again, you go back 12 months, him and Brock Vandagriff were still battling for who was going to be running this Georgia offense. Now that you know you have a guy that's legitimately a Heisman Trophy caliber quarterback, you're going to see a little bit more on Carson Beck's plate. And again, like you said, I think that opens up Georgia's offense a little bit more. Let's go down to probably the biggest question mark we have for this Georgia offense, and really probably the reason why Georgia maybe quote unquote underachieved last year. And we were kind of talking about before we went live. There is a ton of different realities where Georgia was a national championship team last year. They just didn't play their best football against Alabama in the SEC championship game. And I think one of those reasons why is I think they lack that dominant pass rush that they had in the 2021 and 2022 seasons. This is something we've talked a lot about. Though the talent is there, you just got to see it kind of get put on the field in 2024. Kirby Smart has talked about it in press conferences. I think the biggest question mark for this Georgia team, and if they are national champions to end this year, is does this pass rush emerge as that dominant pass rush that we're used to seeing with this Georgia program?
Yeah, honestly, I think you want to see some of these young guys get into the mix a little bit more because, like, I like Stackhouse, I like Brinson, I like Ingram Dawkins.
9 out of 10.
They weren't dominant play. They weren't dominating the way you kind of see Georgia play. They weren't athletic like some of the other inside line or interior defensive linemen Georgia's seen, where again they weren't just clogging holes, but they were beating blocks. They were getting to the quarterback, being really, really disruptive. So I think, again, you saw some moments from Kristen Miller, like in that Alabama game, even you think like, man, that's kind of different. That's kind of the old Georgia defensive lineman where you have that a little extra juice where it's not just good, solid physical.
We got a little ad roll. I think we can play through it. I'm not sure if that's my tab or your tab, but we'll play through the ads. Dill, one other thing, I kind of want to make it clear to the Georgia fans, like, we're kind of nitpicking a little bit in terms of this Georgia pass rush, but I think Kirby Smart would agree. Kind of to highlight my point, you look at the pass rusher that led Georgia in quarterback hurries, it was Jalen Walker, and he was only a guy that rushed the pass for 124 times. He had 19 quarterback hurries. You go back to the 2021 year and the 2022 year, they had multiple guys that were over 20 quarterback hurries. And so I guess I'll put you on the spot here. If you had to pick a pass rusher for Georgia that leads this unit in quarterback hurries, leads this unit in sacks, who would you be going with?
I think it should be Walker again. I still think Jalen Walker's an unbelievable talent. I was a little puzzled why he wasn't playing a little bit more. And again, Kirby Smart, smarter than me for sure. So maybe there were additional things in how he played the run and some other fundamentals that Kirby would have wanted out of him and that Georgia staff would have wanted. But when he was on the field, he had the best instincts, I thought, had the most or deepest bag of tools, if you will, to get after the quarterback. I think he still should be that guy, but I mean, you kind of do look. You have guys like Damon Wilson, even Gabe Harris. So you have some really interesting young guys who I think can get after it a little bit.
The three names I would nominate: one, Jalen Walker. I've been banging the table for this kid all offseason. I think as a pure pass rusher, there's not many edge rushers that have the juice to test tackles from an athletic standpoint that Jalen Walker has. I think there's kind of just some growing pains with him. Like, I think the Georgia staff is still trying to figure out how to use him on a down-by-down basis. And the thing with Jalen Walker is he doesn't need to be a guy that's on the field every single snap. Look, if you want to play a guy like Chaz Chambliss a little bit more on the first and second downs, a guy that can get it done against the run and then trot Jalen Walker out on those third and long situations, I'm perfectly okay with that. But I think you got to figure out a way to get Jalen Walker just rushing the passer a little bit more. I think another guy is Mikael Williams. And Mikael Williams on the film is a lot more disruptive than what's on the box score. And I think the key for Mikael Williams is, can he translate that disruption to actual negative plays for Georgia? And I think the third is Damon Wilson. You talk about another guy that's just got a different level of athletic juice coming off the edge. You got the guys. Now they just got to put it together in 2024. And you know that's going to be a thing that Kirby Smart's kind of brain shopping. I think that's a term. Workshopping in his brain. Maybe that's a better term. All offseason in terms of how do we get back this elite pass rush. Going to number 4, and kind of a similar conversation, an easy transition is, how does this Georgia program create some more turnovers? And I would probably argue that it starts with that dominant pass rush where you are affecting quarterbacks, you're creating negative plays, putting defense or offenses in a little bit more of difficult spots. Georgia last year, 1.2 takeaways per game. That was 124th in the country. And so you look at these small margins that kind of to winning an SEC championship, to winning a national championship, it's a turnover here or there. And I think Georgia is going to be trying to find those turnovers that let you win those big football games a little bit more consistently in 2024. I kind of will ask you, I guess, how do you see Georgia creating some more turnovers in the 2024 year?
Yeah, man, I think it comes down to having the ability to be a bit more aggressive and attack teams a little more, because you even think some of the big games, it's like Missouri, Alabama, like you didn't get the same sense of them just like stifling teams and being ultra aggressive. There was a little bit of that, and I don't know, maybe not trusting their pass rush or just their pass rush not really making it happen the way you need to have it happen. But Alabama, like Jalen Milroe wasn't under enough pressure. They weren't really putting like him in positions to make the plays that he was making at times during the year against teams like Texas and elsewhere to force those turnovers. And they have the guys in the back end to do it. I think Malachi Starks is the best safety I've seen in college football in a pretty long time. So they have the horses in the back end. I just think they need to find some way to get back to more of an attacking style of defense that I felt like was like lacking.
I do agree. And we talked about this when that game finished up. It did seem like Georgia, I mean, at some points they were playing with 2 quarterback spies. And again, like Kirby Smart's a hell of a lot smarter than the boys when it comes to scheming up on defense. But it did seem like that wasn't the normal Georgia defense that was just trying to take it to opposing offenses. So can they get back to that specifically in the big games? Now, you know, Georgia's going to dominate these mid-tier SEC teams that when you're playing the Alabamas or the LSUs or the Ole Misses, the top teams, the Texases in the SEC. Can you make it happen? Can that elite Georgia pass rush wreak a lot of havoc and start creating some more of those turnovers? Certainly.
Because a little bit of that, like when you go to that 2 spy, it almost makes you feel like they don't have the confidence that their defensive linemen are going to be able to get off blocks and make those plays that you need to make when you're dealing with a quarterback like Jalen Milroe. So, again, I think a lot of this team And it probably does go towards question number 3, if you will, about that defensive line. But I think that is kind of the one thing that at times wasn't the same, wasn't the old Georgia. They need to be that way again.
Number 5, replacing the secondary. And they'll go back 12 months ago. We took so much heat in the comment section from a lot of, not necessarily Georgia fans, but we were kind of saying this secondary is going to be the strength of this defense. I think it certainly was in the 2023 year. That was one of the better secondaries that we've seen in a really long time. I think we're going to look back at that secondary, talk about guys like Javon Bullard and Tyke Smith and Malachi Starks, say like, that was a special unit. You have to replace 3 guys, right? Lassiter, Bullard, Tyke Smith. Can they do it? I think the answer is yes. You look at a guy like Jonell Aguero going into year 2. He was born from the womb to play that star spot in this Georgia defense. Malachi Starks is going to hold it down in the back end. Dalen Everett, Julian Humphrey. I would throw in Ellis Robinson the 4th. I mean, there hasn't been many more talented cornerbacks that we've seen come out of high school. It's hard to start and play a lot at the cornerback spot when you're playing your football in Athens. I think Ellis Robinson's a guy that can do it. I think they can. I think it kind of has the question of, do you have some of these guys like maybe true freshman KJ Bolden step up? But I look at the secondary and say, yeah, they replaced 3 really quality football players. I think this secondary is going to just be fine.
I think that's been like an interesting kind of development, if you will, is you felt like there were moments early on and when Georgia's really starting to come on the rise that it wasn't exactly their secondary being that unit that was the strong suit of that team. There were some moments where it felt like they were taking the backseat to that front 7. But I think you're right. Last couple of years, I mean, that secondary has been as good as anyone. You look at the cornerbacks, big physical guys on both sides of the ball with Humphrey and Dalen Everett. And then again, you got to replace some guys for sure. But I think you just have more belief right now in what they have with these young guys and frankly how this unit's playing as a group than maybe you did a past.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's just too much talent to not be good. Like that, you talk about why Georgia's been so special the last 5 years. It is elite competition across the board. If you want to be a starter on this Georgia defense, whether it's in the front 7, whether it's in the back end, you got to be great. And so I look at this Georgia secondary and say, whoever emerges as your starters, like they're going to be great football players because they're beating out some really good football players. I think the secondary is going to be just fine. I think the question is, do you kind of get that mesh? I think having a guy like Malachi Starks who can play at such a high level from a multitude of different spots. He can play man coverage, can play that center field safety that just goes sideline to sideline. When you have a guy like Malachi Starks, it gets a hell of a lot easier to kind of get your best secondary on the field, if you will. Dill, that'll do it. You make no mistake. This is a national championship caliber team. If they answer these questions that we just talked about, I don't think you're going to see a team that beats Georgia in the 2024 year. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. And we'll talk to y'all later.